In the heart of Virginia's suburban landscape, nestled among neat lawns, trimmed hedges, and quiet cul-de-sacs, stood the home of James and Laura Mitchell. To neighbors and friends, the Mitchells were the embodiment of stability. James, a successful financial advisor in his early 40s, carried the presence of a man who had built a comfortable life through discipline and hard work. Laura, several years younger, was seen as the perfect complement, attractive, well-spoken, and active in the community. Together, they appeared to be a couple that reflected the promise of the American suburban dream: security, prosperity, and peace. The Mitchell residence sat in an upper-middle-class neighborhood just outside Richmond, Virginia. It was the kind of neighborhood where children rode bicycles until dusk, families gathered for weekend barbecues, and homeowners waved to each other from across their driveways. It was not a place where people locked their doors in fear, nor a place where neighbors expected sudden violence. To most, the Mitchell home was just one of many comfortable houses lining the street, blending seamlessly into the atmosphere of order and safety. But inside, that sense of suburban tranquility was quietly fracturing. James Mitchell's professional life gave him respect and authority. Known for his precision and conservative habits, he had built a client list that trusted him with their future. His demeanor was calm, sometimes reserved, but reliable. In private, however, James was more than just his career. He was deeply protective of his marriage, invested in appearances, and unwilling to ignore warning signs that something in his household was not as it seemed. Behind his quiet confidence, suspicion had begun to grow. Laura Mitchell, by contrast, carried a reputation for charm and sociability. She spent her days managing household routines, social events, and maintaining an active social presence within the neighborhood. To casual observers, she was devoted to her husband and proud of the life they had built together. But beneath her polished exterior, Laura harbored a secret. 4 months, she had been engaged in an affair with a man who lived only steps away from her front door. Mark Bennett, their neighbor across the street, was in many ways James's opposite. Mark worked in construction and home remodeling. While James embodied restraint and composure, Mark projected a more rugged confidence, marked by a physical presence that drew attention. He was married as well, living with his wife and children in a house not far from the Mitchells. The proximity made his connection with Laura both daring and dangerous. To anyone looking from the outside, the boundaries between the two households seemed intact. In reality, those boundaries were already blurred beyond repair. The affair between Laura and Mark began quietly, with casual encounters in driveways, brief exchanges during neighborhood gatherings, and routine pleasantries that grew into something more. What started as innocent small talk slowly escalated into clandestine meetings. The very closeness of their homes provided convenience for secrecy but also heightened the risk of exposure. Each stolen moment left traces, subtle but noticeable for someone observant enough to detect. James Mitchell was observant. Over time, he detected patterns that unsettled him. Laura's late returns from errands, her sudden secrecy with her phone, the shift in her attention toward him, all of it pointed to something beyond mere distraction. James did not confront Laura directly, but he began keeping quiet track of her behavior. What looked to outsiders like routine marital life had, behind closed doors, become a quiet investigation. James's suspicion became the hidden undercurrent of the Mitchell household. The Mitchell home itself reflected the couple's success. The garage, driveway, and carefully maintained yard framed a house that was photographed for neighborhood brochures and admired by visitors. Yet, the very spaces that symbolized order would become central in a story of betrayal and violence. The garage, where James often worked late on small projects or took calls in privacy, would eventually serve as the backdrop for the unraveling of everything he had built. Neighbors, recalling the Mitchells in those days, remembered a couple who participated in community gatherings but carried an unusual tension that was difficult to articulate. In hindsight, the moments of strained silence and Laura's distracted manner appeared more significant. But at the time, no one suspected that the Mitchell household was under such strain. Appearances, after all, had always shielded the truth. Laura's relationship with Mark deepened in secrecy. Their connection existed in a fragile balance. Both married, both maintaining outward images of respectability, and both risking exposure at any moment. In the ordinary rhythm of suburban life, they created a dangerous narrative of passion and deception. James's suspicion only tightened the noose. His quiet pursuit of answers, through notes, observations, and silent surveillance, began to close in on Laura's carefully maintained secrecy. By late summer, the Mitchell marriage had reached an invisible breaking point. James's work colleagues noticed subtle changes in him: distraction, fatigue, and a sharper edge in his tone. He was known to be methodical and precise, yet he increasingly carried the weight of something unspoken. Friends later recalled that he seemed preoccupied, as though calculating a risk he could not yet fully measure. The source of his unease was known only to him, but it was clear that he was no longer blind to the reality inside his own home. For Laura, the affair carried its own pressures. The excitement of secrecy was paired with the constant risk of discovery. Each day carried the possibility that James would find tangible proof, that neighbors might notice patterns, or that Mark's wife might uncover the truth. The deception required not only lies but also elaborate concealment. What was supposed to remain hidden was inching closer toward exposure, and with it came the possibility of irreversible consequences. Mark, positioned directly across the street, lived in the duality of neighborly appearances and forbidden intimacy. To outsiders, he was simply another suburban husband, mowing his lawn, driving his truck, and engaging in small talk about home maintenance or sports. In private, he was deeply entangled in a relationship that threatened both his family and Laura's marriage. His motivations, whether driven by passion, recklessness, or something darker, would later become the subject of investigation. But at this stage, he was a figure whose presence loomed constantly within James's line of sight. In crime stories, escalation often follows suspicion. In the Mitchell case, that escalation was already underway long before the night of violence. James's notes, his careful tracking of Laura's movements, and his growing distrust created a quiet storm within the household. Laura's continued deception, combined with Mark's proximity, built the conditions for confrontation. Every detail of suburban order, the trimmed lawns, the neat houses, the morning routines, existed alongside a dangerous undercurrent that would soon erupt into tragedy. The Mitchell story represents a common theme in suburban crimes: the contrast between appearance and reality. From the outside, their life looked pristine, untouched by scandal or instability. From the inside, it was marked by secrecy, deception, and suspicion. The suburban dream, often presented as the ultimate marker of stability, was in this case the backdrop for collapse. Every passing day drew the three central figures, James, Laura, and Mark, closer to a point of no return. By early fall, James's suspicion had reached its peak. Though he had not yet revealed the extent of his knowledge, his private documentation showed that he was no longer in the dark. He was actively gathering evidence, determined to confirm what he already believed. The marriage, once built on trust and admiration, had become an arena of silence, secrecy, and quiet investigation. For Laura, the walls were closing in. For Mark, the risk of exposure was growing. For James, the search for truth was becoming increasingly urgent. The calm surface of the Virginia suburb masked a reality that would soon be impossible to ignore. The Mitchell home, once a symbol of success, was on the brink of becoming a crime scene. The quiet cul-de-sac, known for its safety and predictability, would soon be flooded with police vehicles, forensic teams, and media crews. And the story that began as a tale of marriage and stability would be retold as a narrative of betrayal, violence, and unresolved questions. In the weeks leading up to the violent night in Virginia, the Mitchell household had shifted into an atmosphere of quiet unease. James Mitchell, once steady and focused, now lived in a state of vigilance. His suspicions were no longer vague feelings, they were sharpened into conviction. Laura's movements, her unexplained absences, and her concealed messages were no longer passing curiosities, they were signals of betrayal. And James, determined to know the truth, began turning his own home into the center of a private investigation. James's approach reflected his professional nature. As a financial advisor, he had spent years analyzing patterns, detecting inconsistencies, and documenting details. That same discipline now guided his suspicions about his wife. He started small. He paid closer attention to Laura's daily schedule. He kept note of when she left the house, when she returned, and whether her explanations aligned with the time gaps. His suspicions were reinforced by irregularities that he could not explain away. What once felt like coincidence now looked deliberate. Laura's behavior, meanwhile, revealed the classic signs of concealment. Her phone, once casually left on counters and tables, became guarded. She began carrying it from room to room, keeping the screen turned away, reacting quickly to notifications. Internet searches and messaging apps were cleared more often. And in the evenings, she spent more time outside or in secluded parts of the house, claiming calls from friends or errands that stretched beyond reasonable durations. James noticed each change. Each new inconsistency added to a mental ledger that only he could see. Mark Bennett's presence across the street complicated matters. His house, directly visible from the Mitchell driveway, became a constant reminder of James's suspicions. Neighbors described frequent sightings of Mark in the Mitchells' vicinity, often under casual pretenses, borrowing tools, offering assistance, exchanging brief conversations. But James, through his careful observations, recognized patterns that went beyond neighborly courtesy. He noticed that Laura's unexplained absences often aligned with times when Mark was also unaccounted for. The proximity of the two households, meant to be an ordinary feature of suburban convenience, was in reality the geography of an affair unfolding in plain sight. James began keeping written notes. In a small notebook tucked away in his office, he documented times, dates, and observations. He recorded when Laura left, when she returned, and the excuses she gave. He logged details about Mark's presence, the movements of his truck, the times he was seen outside. These notes, later discovered by investigators, painted a picture of a man who was methodically building a case for himself, preparing either to confront his wife or to present undeniable proof of her betrayal. The notes did not contain accusations. They contained facts, assembled piece by piece, like evidence prepared for trial. The tension inside the Mitchell household grew thicker. To neighbors, nothing appeared unusual. But behind closed doors, James and Laura lived in a fragile silence. Arguments surfaced, muffled but unmistakable. Neighbors later recalled hearing raised voices during the night. They were brief, never extended into open conflict, but frequent enough to suggest a household under strain. For James, the arguments were not about speculation. They were about truth pressing against concealment. For Laura, the pressure of maintaining her secret was intensifying. Each confrontation left her scrambling to protect a story that was rapidly unraveling. Mark's role in the unfolding tension became more evident as the affair deepened. He too carried the risks of exposure. His wife remained unaware, but the constant proximity of the Mitchell home placed him in a dangerous position. Each visit, each private exchange with Laura, increased the likelihood of discovery. For both, secrecy had shifted from thrilling to perilous. Yet the affair continued. The momentum of deception had gone too far to retreat without consequences. Both were bound together in a dangerous dependency, each moment fueling the inevitability of collapse. By late September, James's demeanor had changed noticeably. At work, colleagues described him as distracted, less patient, and visibly tired. He remained professional, but his usual focus was fractured. Friends who saw him outside of work noticed a sharper edge in his tone, a preoccupation that he did not explain. To those closest to him, it was clear that James was carrying a burden, though its details remained private. His suspicion of Laura was no longer silent. He began confiding vague hints to trusted friends, expressing concern about her behavior without disclosing the full extent of his evidence. He was inching closer to confrontation. Laura, under mounting pressure, attempted to maintain normalcy. She continued attending community events, social gatherings, and neighborhood activities. But her behavior carried subtle shifts. Neighbors noticed that she seemed distracted, often checking her phone, glancing toward Mark's house. Her participation in conversations was less engaged. The facade of stability was cracking, even if others could not yet identify the cause. To those who looked closely, Laura was a woman caught between two conflicting realities: the image of a devoted wife and the secrecy of an affair that threatened to destroy everything. The nights grew heavier inside the Mitchell home. James spent more time in the garage, a space where he often worked on projects or took private calls. The garage, cluttered with tools and storage boxes, became his refuge from the growing tension indoors. It was also where he kept his notes, hidden but accessible. The garage was not just a workshop, it was the space where James processed the unraveling of his marriage. Neighbors would later recall seeing the light from the garage at odd hours, a sign of James's late-night preoccupation. The affair between Laura and Mark continued under these conditions, reckless but persistent. Their communications grew more secretive. Meetings became more calculated. But secrecy is fragile and mistakes left traces. James, in his vigilance, noticed these traces. A receipt, a misplaced item, an overheard fragment of a conversation. Each detail confirmed what he already believed. His notes reflected a man no longer uncertain but determined. He was building a narrative of betrayal, waiting for the moment when the truth could no longer be denied. The neighborhood remained oblivious. Children played, families barbecued, lawns were mowed. But within the Mitchell household, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken confrontation. Every interaction between James and Laura carried a double meaning, ordinary on the surface but charged beneath. The silence between them was not peace, it was restraint. Both knew that confrontation was inevitable. It was not a question of if, but when. In early October, the situation escalated further. James discovered inconsistencies in Laura's explanations that could no longer be dismissed. He began to suspect not only infidelity but active deception intended to cover the affair. His notes grew more detailed, more urgent. He circled times, underlined dates, marked connections between Laura's movements and Mark's absences. His suspicion was no longer a shadow. It was documented, organized, undeniable. He was preparing for something. Whether to confront Laura, approach Mark, or involve others remained unclear. But the sense of finality was approaching. For Laura, the walls were closing in. James's growing vigilance left less room for concealment. The affair with Mark, once hidden in convenience, now carried the constant threat of exposure. Each meeting was a risk. Each message was dangerous. She lived in the tension between desire and fear, between passion and dread. The double life she maintained was collapsing, and with it came the rising pressure of choices she could no longer avoid. Mark's presence across the street remained constant. He continued his daily routines, projecting the image of a family man. But his involvement with Laura placed him directly in the center of the storm brewing in the Mitchell household. He was not just a neighbor. He was the focus of James's suspicion, the figure that represented betrayal. Whether Mark understood the extent of James's awareness remains unclear, but his role in the triangle was undeniable. His proximity made him impossible to ignore, and his connection to Laura tied him to the conflict that was reaching its peak. As October unfolded, the tension inside the Mitchell home reached its breaking point. James was no longer simply suspicious. He was actively preparing for confrontation. His notes, later discovered by investigators, showed that he had identified patterns and drawn conclusions. He was on the verge of uncovering the full scope of Laura's affair with Mark. The atmosphere in the home was one of inevitability. Something was about to happen. The night of October 12th would mark the culmination of weeks of suspicion, secrecy, and rising conflict. But in the days leading up to it, the Mitchell home had already become a place defined not by peace but by quiet hostility. The marriage that once appeared stable was fractured beyond repair. The suburban facade had given way to hidden truths, each day pushing the three central figures closer to violence. The complication had reached its peak. The next step was not negotiation or reconciliation. It was tragedy. On the night of October 12th, the quiet Virginia suburb was carrying on as usual. Porch lights glowed, televisions flickered behind curtains, and families settled in for another ordinary evening. But inside the Mitchell household, events were aligning toward a violent turning point. James Mitchell, after weeks of growing suspicion, retreated once more to the garage. The space where he documented his findings, reflected on his marriage, and planned his next move. That night, the garage would not be a refuge. It would become the scene of his death. At 9:37 p.m., neighbors later reported hearing a series of dull, heavy thuds coming from the direction of the Mitchell home. The sounds were sharp enough to draw attention but not immediately alarming in a community accustomed to home repairs, hammering, or late-night projects. Minutes later, the neighborhood fell silent again. No one called the police. No one knocked on the door. The noise faded into the background of suburban life, unnoticed as the sound of violence. James Mitchell's body was discovered in the garage less than an hour later. He had suffered multiple blows to the head, delivered with a hammer found at the scene. The bloody tool lay near his body, partially hidden beneath scattered items from the garage shelves. His injuries were brutal, leaving little doubt that the attack was personal and deliberate. Investigators would later conclude that James had little chance to defend himself. The attack was sudden, direct, and sustained until fatal. At first glance, the scene appeared to suggest a burglary gone wrong. A side window of the garage showed signs of forced entry. Tools and household items were scattered across the floor. A drawer had been pulled open, its contents spilled. To the untrained eye, it was chaos consistent with a break-in. The staging was convincing enough that first responders logged the incident as a probable home invasion. But almost immediately, subtle inconsistencies emerged. Nothing of significant value had been taken. James's wallet was untouched. Electronics in plain sight remained in their places. Even Laura's jewelry, stored upstairs in an easily accessible box, was undisturbed. Forensic teams noted that the forced window appeared inconsistent with typical break-ins. Glass fragments were scattered inward, but the edges of the frame showed minimal external damage. To detectives, it suggested the break-in might have been staged from inside. Laura Mitchell was the one who placed the 911 call. Her voice, captured in the emergency recording, conveyed shock and panic as she reported finding her husband collapsed in the garage. She told dispatchers she had been upstairs when she heard noises and came down to investigate. By the time paramedics arrived, James was already dead. Laura, described by officers at the scene as visibly shaken, was escorted to the living room while investigators began processing the garage. Neighbors quickly gathered outside as emergency vehicles filled the quiet street. The sight of flashing lights, yellow tape, and forensic teams shattered the calm of the community. Many expressed disbelief that violence could strike so close to home. Some whispered about the possibility of a random burglary escalating into murder. Others speculated about James's work, wondering if a client dispute had followed him home. Few at that moment suspected that the answer might lie within the neighborhood itself. Detectives began reconstructing the timeline of the evening. They learned that James had returned home shortly after 8:30 p.m. and gone directly to the garage. Laura claimed she was inside preparing for bed when the attack occurred. The timeline, however, left gaps. The sounds reported by neighbors, those heavy thuds, aligned closely with the estimated time of death. But Laura's account of hearing them conflicted with her description of how quickly she discovered the body. Investigators noted the discrepancy but did not press immediately. The hammer, identified as a tool belonging to the Mitchell household, became the central piece of evidence. It bore James's blood and hair but no clear fingerprints. The absence of usable prints suggested the killer had either worn gloves or wiped the weapon clean. To detectives, this detail was significant. Burglars rarely take the time to erase prints during chaotic break-ins. This looked deliberate, methodical. It looked like someone wanted the scene to appear random while concealing their own involvement. Forensic teams also examined the signs of forced entry. The window, though broken, raised suspicion. Glass shards on the inside suggested entry, but the distribution of fragments did not fully align with an intruder climbing through. Detectives theorized that the break-in had been staged after James was killed, designed to mislead investigators. If true, it pointed to someone with access to the house and enough familiarity to create a believable cover. Attention soon turned inward. Investigators began focusing on Laura Mitchell. As the spouse, she was naturally the first person of interest. Her behavior at the scene, distressed but cooperative, did not rule out involvement. Her story, however, contained small inconsistencies. She claimed she heard noises but delayed checking until later. She described discovering James collapsed but could not explain why she did not hear the struggle or the fatal blows, despite their volume. Detectives noted these gaps and began viewing Laura not just as a grieving widow but as a potential suspect. As the investigation expanded, detectives uncovered James's notebook. Found in his office, the notebook contained weeks of entries documenting his suspicions about Laura's affair with their neighbor, Mark Bennett. The notes were meticulous, detailing Laura's absences, her phone behavior, and Mark's movements. To investigators, this discovery shifted the case entirely. What had first looked like a burglary now carried the clear shadow of motive: betrayal, secrecy, and the possibility of murder driven by personal ties. Mark Bennett's name surfaced almost immediately. As neighbors, his proximity made him impossible to ignore. When detectives questioned him, Mark projected calm cooperation. He expressed shock at James's death and insisted he had been home with his wife at the time of the murder. But detectives, armed with James's notes, saw through the veneer. The documented connection between Laura and Mark placed them both under scrutiny. Fingerprints lifted from the garage revealed a potential link. While most prints belonged to James and Laura, partial prints resembling marks were identified on a shelf near the crime scene. Investigators could not immediately prove when those prints were left, but the discovery added weight to James's suspicions. It suggested Mark had been in the garage at some point, a detail difficult to explain as mere coincidence. The possibility of a staged burglary grew stronger as detectives compared timelines. No neighbors reported seeing suspicious vehicles or strangers in the area. Security cameras from nearby homes captured no sign of forced entry by outsiders. The only movements recorded were familiar: James returning home, Laura leaving briefly earlier in the evening, and Mark's truck parked in its usual spot. To detectives, the evidence pointed inward, not outward. The brutality of James's death also carried significance. The repeated blows suggested anger, not opportunistic violence. Burglars seeking valuables rarely linger to attack with such force. This was a killing driven by emotion, by intent. Investigators increasingly viewed the murder as the product of the love triangle James had uncovered, a confrontation that ended with lethal violence and a staged scene to mask its true nature. Media coverage quickly descended on the neighborhood. Local stations broadcast images of the Mitchell home cordoned off with crime scene tape, reporters speculating about the mysterious killing in what was once considered a safe community. Headlines framed the incident as a shocking suburban tragedy. As details of James's notebook leaked, the narrative shifted toward scandal, a love triangle, betrayal, and murder. The story that had begun as a suspected burglary had transformed into a tale of deception and possible conspiracy. Detectives faced a critical question: who delivered the fatal blows? Was it Laura, desperate to silence her husband before he exposed her affair? Or was it Mark, seeking to remove the barrier between himself and Laura? The hammer offered no clear answer. The staged burglary offered only suspicion. But the convergence of evidence, the affair, the notes, the fingerprints, pointed to a crime committed not by strangers, but by those closest to James. By the end of October, the investigation was no longer about whether James had been killed in a random act. It was about which member of the triangle had crossed the line from secrecy to murder. The garage, once a place of work and refuge, had become the stage for a brutal ending. And the community, once defined by calm and safety, now carried the weight of a mystery. In the quiet suburban night, who swung the hammer that ended James Mitchell's life? The quiet suburban neighborhood in Virginia, once known for its serenity, now stands at the center of a sensational criminal case. What began as a shocking discovery in a garage has transformed into a web of deceit, betrayal, and calculated violence. As the investigation into the death of James Mitchell intensifies, law enforcement narrows its focus on two people who, until recently, lived steps away from one another. They are not strangers, nor opportunistic intruders, but two individuals whose private choices ignited a deadly chain of events. Laura Mitchell, the victim's wife, and Mark Collins, the neighbor she was secretly involved with, are now the prime suspects in what police describe as a crime of passion fueled by secrecy and desperation. Detectives meticulously pieced together the evidence that discredited the early theory of a home invasion. The broken window in the Mitchell residence was determined to be staged. Forensic analysis revealed that the glass shards were scattered in a pattern inconsistent with an outside break-in. Investigators concluded that the window had been broken from within, designed to mislead them into believing burglary was the motive. But nothing had been stolen. James's wallet remained intact. Electronic devices, cash, and valuables were untouched. The scene was deliberately arranged, a false cover to mask the real motive, removing James Mitchell permanently from the love triangle that threatened to unravel. At the heart of the investigation lay the hammer, discovered beside James's lifeless body. It was a common household tool, but the blows it delivered were far from ordinary. The brutality suggested anger, personal conflict, and deep emotional motivation. Crime scene technicians lifted partial fingerprints from the handle. Initial tests revealed smudges too blurred for immediate identification, but subsequent forensic enhancement pointed toward a match. While one set matched James himself, the others raised more questions. Both Laura and Mark's prints were found on the tool, each providing a connection impossible to ignore. Authorities now faced the task of determining who had wielded it in the fatal act, or whether both played roles in a coordinated plan. The autopsy report provided chilling detail. James Mitchell sustained multiple blunt force injuries to the head, each consistent with the hammer found at the scene. The medical examiner determined the time of death aligned with the evening when neighbors reported hearing unusual noises from the garage. Combined with testimony from neighbors about past arguments, the case was growing stronger. But prosecutors knew motive and opportunity alone were not enough. They required evidence of intent, collaboration, or direct involvement linking Laura and Mark to the crime. Investigators retraced James's final weeks. Inside his office, detectives found handwritten notes documenting his suspicions. He recorded times Laura left the house, discrepancies in her stories, and references to seeing Mark at odd hours. The notes painted a picture of a husband quietly building a case against his wife, anticipating a confrontation. One particular entry stood out. James wrote that he planned to confront Laura with his suspicions soon and, if confirmed, consider divorce. For prosecutors, this discovery added a critical layer. Divorce would mean division of assets, exposure of the affair, and public humiliation. For Laura, it would mean losing the stability and reputation she had maintained in her community. For Mark, it would mean scandal in his own marriage and potential loss of family. The stakes were high, and the possibility of James revealing the affair gave investigators a powerful motive for both suspects. Laura's interviews with detectives shifted over time. At first, she maintained innocence, suggesting James may have startled a burglar. But inconsistencies grew apparent. She claimed she had been running errands at the time of the murder, but security footage from a local store failed to place her there during the critical hour. Instead, surveillance cameras caught her vehicle circling the neighborhood streets not far from her home. When pressed, Laura faltered, unable to explain her movements convincingly. Investigators began to see her as more than a grieving widow. She was now a person of interest. Meanwhile, Mark Collins faced his own scrutiny. Detectives obtained warrants to search his property. In his garage, they discovered clothing with traces of what appeared to be blood. Forensic testing confirmed the stains matched James Mitchell's DNA. This discovery shifted the weight of suspicion heavily onto Mark. Yet, Laura's connections to the crime scene could not be ignored. The hammer carried both their prints, and staged evidence suggested planning. Investigators grew convinced this was not a random act of rage by one individual, but rather the product of collaboration between two people whose secret relationship had crossed the line into murder. Prosecutors presented the possibility of conspiracy. They argued that Laura and Mark shared both motive and opportunity. Laura faced exposure and financial repercussions if James pursued divorce. Mark faced the collapse of his own marriage and the destruction of his reputation. By eliminating James, both could protect themselves and potentially begin a new life together without the constant threat of discovery. This theory aligned with the staged burglary, which required forethought rather than impulsive action. It also explained why both sets of fingerprints were present on the weapon. Neighbors who once admired the Mitchell stability now recalled moments that seemed, in hindsight, like warning signs. Some reported seeing Laura and Mark spending time together while their spouses were away. Others mentioned that James had appeared increasingly withdrawn in recent months. The suburban facade, once flawless, was collapsing under the weight of testimony and forensic evidence. The community, shaken by the brutality of the crime, now grappled with the reality that the perpetrators were not strangers, but trusted members of their quiet neighborhood. As the investigation reached its peak, police made their move. On a quiet morning, officers executed simultaneous arrests. Laura Mitchell was taken into custody at her residence, escorted past stunned neighbors who watched from behind curtains. Across the street, Mark Collins was handcuffed and led away from his home, his wife left in visible shock as media cameras captured the moment. The arrests confirmed what many had already suspected. The affair had spiraled far beyond secrecy and deception, ending in a violent conspiracy to kill. Prosecutors charged both Laura and Mark with murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and evidence tampering. In press statements, law enforcement emphasized the calculated nature of the crime. The staged burglary, the coordinated alibis, and the forensic connections painted a picture of deliberate planning. Investigators described the crime as a betrayal not only of James Mitchell but also of the community's trust. The case, now heading toward trial, became a national story. It embodied the dark potential of hidden relationships, where lies and infidelity converged with greed and desperation. Analysts noted how the suburban setting, often idealized as safe and predictable, provided the backdrop for a crime as brutal as any urban homicide. For viewers across the country, the Mitchell case was a reminder that behind closed doors, even the most seemingly perfect lives can conceal dangerous secrets. Forensic experts are expected to play a critical role in the upcoming proceedings. The presence of both suspects' fingerprints on the hammer, combined with the blood-stained clothing found in Mark's garage, will likely anchor the prosecution's case. Meanwhile, Laura's shifting alibis and surveillance footage undermine her credibility. The defense teams will attempt to separate their clients' involvement, possibly shifting blame between one another. Yet, prosecutors remain confident that the combined weight of evidence will prove a joint effort in James Mitchell's murder. The once quiet Virginia neighborhood has now become synonymous with betrayal, violence, and scandal. Neighbors who once shared friendly waves now live with the memory of seeing police cars, crime scene tape, and forensic vans stationed on their streets. The garage where James Mitchell's life ended is no longer just a crime scene. It is a lasting symbol of how secrets can shatter families, friendships, and communities. In the final assessment, detectives closed their files with one undeniable conclusion. James Mitchell's death was not the result of random crime, nor a tragic accident. It was the direct outcome of a dangerous affair, a calculated betrayal by those closest to him. The arrests of Laura and Mark mark the end of the investigation, but the beginning of a legal battle that will determine their fates. As the story closes, one haunting question remains for all who followed it. Was James Mitchell's murder the result of love turned lethal, or was it the inevitable consequence of a web of lies that could no longer hold? What is certain is that justice now points in one direction, toward Laura Mitchell and Mark Collins, the two people whose choices turned a quiet suburban life into a national tragedy.